The great hall of Viridian Prime stretched wider than any human stadium. Its walls made of crystal that caught starlight from 3 different suns, and the ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top where the air grew thin and cold. General Krathox stood in the center of this massive space, his 4 arms folded across his chest as he waited for the council members to settle into their seats. He was a Zenthari, a species that had conquered 17 star systems before joining the Galactic Coalition 300 cycles ago, and his scales were deep purple, a color that his people associated with wisdom earned through battle. Around him sat representatives from 47 different species, each one a master of warfare in their own way, and each one accustomed to winning. The Aqueous Collective sent Commander Velrith, a being that looked like a massive jellyfish floating in a tank of glowing blue liquid, and the Hive Cluster sent Admiral Thrain, an insectoid creature whose compound eyes could process tactical data faster than most computers. There were others too, beings made of living rock, creatures that breathed methane, and things that existed partially in dimensions humans had not yet discovered. They all turned their attention to Krathox as he activated the holographic display at the center of the chamber. The image showed a small planet orbiting a yellow star, its surface mostly blue ocean with 3 major continents, and Krathox gestured with one of his upper arms, causing the image to zoom in on a settlement near the equator of the largest continent. The colony looked peaceful from orbit, with neat rows of buildings, agricultural fields laid out in geometric patterns, and a small spaceport with 3 aging frigates docked at its landing pads. Krathox had seen hundreds of colonies like this one, places where species tried to build new lives far from their home worlds, and most of them surrendered the moment a coalition fleet appeared in orbit. This one should have been no different, but something about it made his scales itch with unease. He cleared his throat, the sound emerging as a low rumble that the translation devices picked up and converted into whatever language each council member understood best. "The humans have rejected our ultimatum," he said, watching the reactions around the chamber. "We offered them standard terms, relocation to a new world with full compensation and protection under coalition law, but their answer was a single word transmitted from their governor." The hologram changed to show a text message in the angular script that humans used, and Krathox read it aloud even though everyone present could see it clearly. No, that was all they said, and then they cut off all communications. Commander Velrith pulsed with colors that indicated confusion, the liquid in his tank swirling as he moved closer to examine the hologram. "This makes no sense," he said, his voice coming through as bubbling sounds that the translators rendered into speech. "We have 800 warships in orbit around their planet, and they have 3 frigates that our intelligence says are at least 40 cycles old. Their population is only 50,000. Mostly farmers and technicians with no military training, and yet they refuse to leave peacefully. What could they possibly hope to achieve?" Admiral Thrain clicked his mandibles together in a gesture that his species used to indicate deep thought, and he gestured with one of his 6 legs toward another part of the holographic display. "I have been studying their transmissions," he said, "and there is something unusual about these humans. Their governor is named Peter Hughes, and he sent a follow-up message after the initial rejection." The hologram shifted to show another text message, and Thrain read it carefully. "Come and take it," those were his exact words. The chamber fell silent for a moment as the assembled generals and admirals processed this information, and Krathox could see confusion on the faces of those species whose expressions he had learned to read. Defiance was not unknown in the galaxy. There had been other species who resisted coalition authority before, but usually they had some hope of victory, or at least some leverage to negotiate better terms. These humans had neither yet. They stood firm like a mountain, refusing to acknowledge the storm coming toward it. Krathox pulled up another screen, this one showing dense text and images from the human cultural database that Coalition intelligence had been compiling for the past 20 cycles since first contact. "I have been reviewing their history," he said, "and there is a pattern that concerns me. The humans have a term they use in their military academies, something they call death ground strategy, and the concept is simple but disturbing. When trapped with no possibility of retreat, when facing certain defeat, humans do not surrender. Instead, they become more dangerous, more unpredictable, and more willing to inflict casualties on their enemy regardless of the cost to themselves." He gestured again, and the hologram displayed images from human history, battles that had taken place on their home world long before they developed space travel. There was a narrow mountain pass where 300 humans held off an army of hundreds of thousands for 3 days, and there was a fort in a desert where fewer than 200 defenders fought thousands until the last human fell. There was a city that refused to surrender even as it burned around them, its people fighting in the rubble for months until nothing remained but ghosts and memories. In each case, Krathox explained, the humans knew they would lose, but they fought anyway, and in each case, they made their enemies pay such a terrible price that the battles became legends that haunted the victors for generations. Commander Velrith's colors shifted to something that the translators interpreted as dismissive amusement. You are suggesting that we should fear them because of primitive battles fought with chemical propellants and metal blades, he said, and the liquid in his tank rippled with what might have been laughter. We have weapons that can crack planets, shields that can withstand stars, and soldiers bred specifically for combat. What can farmers with old rifles do against the might of the coalition? But General Krathox did not laugh, and he did not smile. Instead, he zoomed the hologram in on one particular image from human history, a photograph taken during what they called their Second World War. It showed a city reduced to absolute rubble. Not a single building left standing, and yet humans had continued fighting there, using the wreckage itself as weapons and fortifications. They held that city, he said quietly, for 225 days against an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. And when it was over, the enemy had lost so many soldiers that it changed the course of the entire war. The humans lost even more, but they considered it a victory because they had made their enemy bleed. Admiral Thrain leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting the holographic images in thousands of tiny fragments. What are you suggesting, Krathox? He asked, and his mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation among his kind. Are you saying we should negotiate with them? Give them what they want simply because they refuse to be reasonable? Krathox turned to face the Admiral directly, his forearms spreading wide in a gesture of openness. I am saying we should be careful, he replied, and his voice carried a weight of concern that made several council members shift uncomfortably. I am saying that we should study them more thoroughly before we commit to a ground assault. Because if we go down there and they fight the way their history suggests they will, we might win, but the cost could be higher than anyone in this chamber expects. The chamber erupted in debate, voices rising in dozens of languages as the translation devices struggled to keep up. And some council members argued for immediate bombardment from orbit, reducing the colony to ash and making an example that would deter future resistance. Others suggested a blockade, starving the colony until they had no choice but to surrender, and a few, very few, agreed with Krathox that caution was warranted. But the majority opinion was clear. The coalition had never backed down from such a minor threat, and they would not start now. The vote was called, and it passed with overwhelming support, and General Krathox was given command of the operation with orders to secure the colony using ground forces rather than orbital bombardment. The council wanted prisoners, wanted to understand why these humans had chosen such a foolish path, and wanted to demonstrate that resistance would be crushed but not through simple destruction. They wanted the other species watching this confrontation to see that the coalition was powerful enough to take what it wanted, without resorting to the ultimate weapons. As the council members filed out of the Great Hall, returning to their ships and their duties, Krathox remained standing before the holographic display, and he stared at the peaceful-looking colony below, at the farms and homes and schools where 50,000 humans went about their lives, unaware that their fate had just been sealed. He thought about the images from their history, about the desperate last stands and the battles where defeat became legend, and he wondered if perhaps the council had made a terrible mistake. But orders were orders, and he was a soldier above all else, so he would do his duty, and he would lead his troops down to that colony, and he would secure it for the coalition. But deep in his hearts, all three of them, he felt something he had not experienced in many cycles of warfare, and it took him a moment to recognize the feeling because it was so unfamiliar. It was fear, not of defeat because victory was certain, but fear of what? The landing craft cut through the atmosphere of Kepler 442b like knives through silk, their shields glowing orange from friction as they descended toward the agricultural sector of the human colony. And General Krathox watched from his command ship in orbit, monitoring the feeds from 200 elite Zenthari shock troopers as they approached their landing zones. These were not ordinary soldiers, but veterans of dozens of campaigns. warriors who had broken resistance on worlds where the defenders actually had modern weapons and training, and Krathox had chosen them specifically because he wanted this operation to be quick and clean. The plan was simple: land in the farmlands where resistance would be lightest, secure the civilian population, and move toward the colony center where the governor and his administration were likely hiding. It should have been over in hours, a textbook operation that would be taught in military academies as an example of efficient conquest. The first landing craft touched down in a wheat field that stretched for kilometers in every direction, the golden grain swaying in a gentle breeze that carried the scent of growing things, and Commander Grexic was the first to emerge, his forearms holding weapons that could punch through reinforced steel. He was one of Krathox's best officers, a veteran who had personally led the assault on 3 rebellious colonies, and he scanned the area with practiced efficiency, looking for threats or ambush points. Behind him, his troops spread out in a standard formation, covering all approaches and maintaining clear lines of fire, and for a moment, everything seemed perfect. The sun was warm, the sky was blue, and there was no sign of resistance anywhere in sight. Then Grexic saw her, a single human female standing in the middle of the wheat field about 50 meters away, and she was holding what looked like an ancient rifle, the kind of weapon that used chemical propellants to fire metal projectiles. She was small by Zenthari standards, probably no taller than Grexic's chest, and she wore simple clothing that looked more appropriate for farming than fighting. Her hair was brown and tied back in a practical manner, and her face showed no fear, no anger, just a kind of sad determination that Grexic found puzzling. She held a small radio transmitter in one hand and the rifle in the other, and she made no move to raise either weapon. Grexic activated his external speakers, his voice booming across the field in the human language that his translator had been programmed with. "You there, human," he called out. "You are in violation of coalition law by bearing arms against authorized peacekeeping forces, and you will surrender immediately or be neutralized." He expected her to drop the weapon, to fall to her knees, to show some sign of the fear that every other species displayed when facing Zenthari warriors, but she did none of these things. Instead, she raised the radio to her lips and spoke in a calm, clear voice that carried across the field. "My name is Lisa Bennett," she said, "and I am a citizen of this colony and a free human being." She paused, looking at Grexic and the 200 armed soldiers behind him with eyes that seemed to see something beyond the immediate situation. "Turn back," she continued. "This is your only warning, and you will not get another one." Grexic felt something he rarely experienced, a flash of genuine anger at the audacity of this tiny creature who dared to threaten him, and he laughed, the sound coming out as a deep rumble that his species used to intimidate prey. "You are one human with a primitive weapon," he said, "and I have 200 warriors armed with weapons that can level buildings. You cannot win. You cannot even hurt us, so step aside or die, and those are your only options." Lisa Bennett smiled, but there was no humor in the expression, only a deep sadness that made Grexic hesitate for just a moment. "We tried diplomacy," she said. "We sent messages explaining why this colony matters to us and why we cannot simply leave. We tried reason. We offered to negotiate, to find a solution that would work for everyone, but you did not listen." She raised the ancient rifle to her shoulder, aiming it not at Grexic but at a point somewhere beyond him. "Now you have given us no choice," she said, "and you will learn what humans do when you give them no choice." She fired a single shot, the crack of the rifle sharp and loud in the quiet morning air, and the bullet flew past Grexic's head, deliberately missing by several meters. Then she turned and ran toward a tree line at the edge of the field, moving with surprising speed for such a small being, and Grexic felt his anger surge into rage. No one defied him. No one insulted him by firing a warning shot, and no one ran from Zenthari warriors and expected to escape. He roared orders to his troops, commanding them to pursue and capture the human, to make an example of her arrogance, and the soldiers obeyed, charging across the wheat field in formation, their weapons ready but held low, because the orders had been to take prisoners when possible. They had crossed about 30 meters when the field exploded. Beneath them, in the wheat that had looked so peaceful and innocent, had been hiding something terrible. Mines buried just below the surface and connected to motion sensors that detected the weight and heat signature of Zenthari warriors. The explosions were not random but carefully planned, detonating in a pattern that maximized casualties and prevented the soldiers from taking cover. And Grexic saw his troops torn apart, their armor no protection against explosives that had been designed specifically to defeat it. He tried to call for a retreat, but more mines exploded, cutting off escape routes and channeling the survivors into a narrow corridor that led straight toward the tree line. That was when the humans opened fire from concealed positions among the trees, and Grexic realized with horror that Lisa Bennett had not been alone, that the entire forest edge was lined with shooters who had been waiting for this exact moment. They fired in disciplined volleys, their ancient rifles proving more than adequate at this range, and their bullets found weak points in Zenthari armor that Coalition intelligence had said were secret. These were not soldiers, Grexic thought as he dove for cover behind a small rise in the ground. These were farmers and teachers and colonists who had never seen war, and yet they fought with a precision that professional military forces would envy. He managed to activate his communicator, calling for air support and medical evacuation, as he watched his carefully trained troops fall around him, and the response came quickly, 3 gunships dropping from orbit with weapons that could reduce the entire forest to ash. But the humans had prepared for this too, surface-to-air missiles launching from hidden positions in the colony, and these were not military-grade weapons but improvised devices built from mining equipment and civilian technology, cobbled together by engineers who had never designed weapons before. They should not have worked, should not have been able to track and hit military spacecraft. But they did, and Grexic watched in disbelief as 2 gunships exploded in midair while the third managed to retreat with its shields failing. The battle lasted 17 minutes from the first mine detonation to the final shot, and when it was over, Grexic found himself lying in a crater with 12 other survivors, surrounded by the bodies of 63 warriors who had been alive and confident just minutes before. The humans stopped shooting once the Zenthari stopped moving, their discipline holding even in the heat of combat, and Grexic could hear them calling to each other through the smoke, checking on their own casualties and coordinating their withdrawal to secondary positions. He listened to their voices, calm and professional, discussing fields of fire and fallback routes and ammunition supplies, and he realized something that made his blood run cold. They had planned this, not just prepared but actually war-gamed the entire scenario, and predicted Coalition tactics with frightening accuracy. From orbit, General Krathox watched the tactical feeds with growing unease, and he saw the casualty reports coming in, saw the burning wreckage of his gunships, and saw the human defenders pulling back to new positions in good order. He had expected to lose perhaps 5 or 10 soldiers in the entire operation, acceptable casualties for securing an entire colony, but he had lost 63 in the first engagement, and the humans had lost maybe 20 at most. The mathematics were horrifying because at this rate, pacifying the colony would cost him thousands of troops and take weeks or months instead of hours. Commander Velrith's voice came through the communication system, his colors visible through the holographic display as shifting patterns of confusion and concern. "What manner of species fights like this?" he asked, and his voice carried an edge of fear that Krathox had never heard from him before. "They must know they cannot win. They must understand that we can simply bombard them from orbit if they continue to resist. So why do they fight?" Admiral Thrain answered before Krathox could speak, his mandibles clicking rapidly as he processed the tactical data. "I do not think they care about winning," he said slowly, and his compound eyes reflected the images of burning wheat fields and broken soldiers. "I think they care about making us regret we ever came here. I think they want us to remember this day every time we consider threatening another human colony. And I think they are succeeding." Krathox stared at the displays, watching as his medical teams tried to evacuate the wounded while staying under cover from human snipers who could have killed them, but chose not to, a small mercy that somehow made the situation worse. 3 weeks had passed since the first disastrous assault on the human colony, and General Krathox stood in his command center reviewing casualty reports that made his scales ache with a pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. The numbers were precise and terrible. 900 Coalition soldiers dead and another 600 wounded badly enough to require medical evacuation. Against this, the humans had lost over 2,000 of their own, more than 4% of their entire population, and yet somehow the colony still fought. By every measure that military science recognized, the Coalition was winning, but Krathox had been a soldier long enough to know that victory could taste like defeat when the cost became too high. He pulled up a tactical map that showed the colony divided into sectors, each one color-coded to show Coalition control, and what he saw troubled him deeply. The agricultural zones were secure now, but only after being turned into wastelands. The farmlands burned or poisoned to deny the humans cover and resources. The residential districts were contested, with coalition troops holding the main streets during daylight, but retreating to fortified positions at night when human raiders made the darkness their ally. The industrial sector remained completely in human hands, its factories and workshops producing improvised weapons at a rate that coalition intelligence said should be impossible. And at the center, the government complex where Governor Peter Hughes coordinated the defense, surrounded by layers of fortifications that his troops had died trying to breach. A movement at the edge of his vision made Krathok's turn, and he saw Commander Velrith approaching. His floating tank gliding smoothly across the floor and the colors swirling through his body spoke of concern and confusion. "I have been reviewing the intelligence reports on individual humans," Velrith said without preamble, "and I cannot make sense of what I am seeing. These people have no military training. Most of them are farmers or technicians or teachers, and yet they fight with a skill that suggests years of combat experience." Krathok gestured toward a holographic display that showed profiles of specific humans who had become known to coalition intelligence through captured communications or direct observation. "This one," he said, pointing to an image of a broad-shouldered man with graying hair. "His name is Jake Morrison, and according to our database, he was a mechanic who maintained mining equipment before we arrived. Now he leads a squad that has destroyed 12 of our armored vehicles using weapons he built himself from civilian mining lasers." He paused, switching to another profile that showed a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and laugh lines around her mouth. "This is Linda Hayes, a school teacher who specialized in literature and child development, and now she runs their supply network, using children to move weapons and ammunition through tunnels that our sensors cannot detect. She has turned her students into a logistics corps that operates under our noses, and we cannot stop them without shooting children, which the Council has forbidden." Velrith's colors shifted to something that the translators struggled to interpret, but Krathok's thought might be horror, or perhaps admiration, or maybe some combination of both. "How is this possible?" Velrith asked, and his voice carried a note of genuine bewilderment. "Where did they learn these skills, and why do they continue fighting when they must know they will lose?" Admiral Thrain entered the command center before Krathok could answer, his multiple legs carrying him quickly across the floor, and his compound eyes were focused on a data pad he carried in one of his forward limbs. "I have the answer to at least part of that question," Thrain said as he approached. "I have been analyzing human cultural transmissions, their entertainment and educational materials, and I believe I understand something about them that we missed." He activated his data pad and projected a series of images into the air, showing scenes from human movies and television programs and games. "They teach war to their children," Thrain continued, "not as an academic subject but as entertainment and moral instruction. From the time they are small, humans are exposed to stories about desperate last stands, about outnumbered defenders holding against impossible odds, about ordinary people becoming heroes through courage and sacrifice. It is woven into their culture so deeply that they do not even recognize it as military training." Krathok studied the images and saw battles from human history recreated with stunning detail, saw fictional stories about resistance against overwhelming force, saw games where players took the role of defenders fighting to the last bullet. He began to understand something that chilled him to his core. These humans were not trained soldiers, but they had been preparing for this moment their entire lives without even knowing it. Every story they told themselves, every hero they celebrated, every lesson they taught their children, it all pointed toward this singular truth that humans would rather die fighting than live in submission. A communication alert interrupted. His thoughts and Krathok's accepted the incoming transmission to find himself looking at the face of Governor Peter Hughes. The human looked tired, his face lined with exhaustion and his eyes red from lack of sleep. But his expression showed no hint of surrender or despair. "I am recording this message for broadcast across all coalition frequencies," Hughes said, "and I want every species in the galaxy to hear what I have to say." Krathok started to cut the transmission, but something stopped him. Perhaps curiosity, or perhaps the grudging respect he had developed for this stubborn human leader. "You wonder why we fight?" Hughes continued, and his voice was calm and steady despite the circumstances. "You have ships that can shatter planets. You have weapons we cannot match. You have armies that outnumber us 100 to 1, and yet we stand here, bloodied but unbroken, defiant even in the face of certain defeat. He paused, and Krathox saw something in the human's eyes that he recognized from his own reflection after particularly difficult battles. "You made one mistake," Hughes said, "and it is a mistake that will cost you more than just soldiers. You threatened our home, you threatened our children. You gave us a choice between living on our knees or dying on our feet, and humans have a rule that is older than our spaceflight, older than our nations, older than our written history. We never ever surrender our families." The transmission ended, but Krathox found himself replaying it, listening to the words and trying to understand the psychology behind them. And Commander Velrith moved closer, his tank humming softly in the quiet of the command center. "We should offer them terms," Velrith said quietly. "Generous terms that let them leave with dignity, relocate them to another world, guarantee their safety and autonomy. End this pointless bloodshed before the cost becomes unbearable." It was a reasonable suggestion, the kind of pragmatic solution that had ended dozens of conflicts in Coalition history. But Krathox shook his head slowly. "Admiral Thrain will object," Krathox said, and he gestured toward where the insectoid admiral was reviewing tactical displays. "He will argue that showing mercy now would be interpreted as weakness, that every species watching this conflict will see compromise as proof that the Coalition can be defied successfully. And he will be right in a sense, because if we back down here, then other species will test us and our authority will erode." He paused, his scales darkening with a color that his species associated with difficult truths. "But he will also be wrong, because what we are doing here will teach a different lesson, one that is far more dangerous in the long term." Velrith's colors swirled with confusion, and Krathox pulled up the casualty projections that his tactical computers had generated. "At current rates," he said, pointing to numbers that glowed red against the holographic display, "we will secure the colony in approximately 6 more weeks. We will lose another 2,000 troops, bringing our total casualties to nearly 3,000. The humans will be reduced to fewer than 10,000 survivors, possibly fewer than 5,000 if the fighting becomes more intense." He looked at Velrith, meeting the alien's gaze as best he could given their different biologies. "And every species in the galaxy will learn something from this operation, something that should terrify us." "What will they learn?" Velrith asked, though his colors suggested he already knew the answer. "They will learn that humans made us pay," Krathox said quietly. "They will learn that 50,000 farmers and teachers and colonists cost the mighty Galactic Coalition nearly 3,000 elite soldiers. They will see that untrained civilians with improvised weapons held us off for weeks, that they made us turn their world into a graveyard just to claim victory. And they will ask themselves a question that I have been asking myself every day since this started." He pulled up an image of Earth, the blue jewel that hung in space 800 light-years from where they stood. "What would happen if we fought a real human military?" Krathox asked. "What would happen if we tried to take Earth itself with its 8 billion humans and its actual warships and its trained soldiers and its weapons that can crack continents? What would that cost us, not in weeks but in years, not in thousands but in millions?" The command center fell silent except for the soft hum of computers and the distant sounds of the fleet moving through space, and Velrith's colors faded to something pale and uncertain. "We are not fighting Earth," he said, but the words sounded hollow even through the translator. Day 37 of the siege dawned with smoke hanging heavy over the colony like a funeral shroud, and General Krathox watched from orbit as his forces assembled for what military analysts predicted would be the final assault on the government complex. The building itself was nothing special, just a reinforced concrete structure that had been designed to withstand storms and earthquakes, but not military bombardment. And yet it had become a symbol that transcended its physical form. Behind those walls, Governor Peter Hughes coordinated the last organized resistance with 43 defenders, all that remained of the thousands who had fought and died over the past 5 weeks. The mathematics were finally turning decisively in the Coalition's favor. Overwhelming force concentrated against a handful of exhausted humans who had no hope of escape and no possibility of victory, but somehow Krathox felt no satisfaction at the approaching end. He reviewed the tactical plan one final time, checking the positioning of his troops and the timing of their advance, making sure that every detail was perfect because he owed that much to the soldiers who had died getting this far. The assault would begin with a carefully calibrated bombardment, enough to breach the walls but not enough to collapse the entire structure, because the Council still wanted prisoners and wanted answers. Then his troops would storm through the breaches in 3 waves, overwhelming any remaining defenses through sheer numbers and superior firepower. It should have been simple, should have been routine. But Krathox had learned to expect the unexpected from humans, and so he ordered his forces to assume that every step would be contested and every meter would cost blood. Before he could give the order to commence the bombardment, a new transmission came through from the government complex, and Krathox accepted it immediately, knowing that this might be the last communication from Governor Hughes. The human appeared on the holographic display, looking even more exhausted than in previous broadcasts, and his clothes were torn and stained with dirt and dried blood that might have been his own, or might have belonged to others. But his eyes were still clear, and his voice was still steady as he began what everyone listening knew would be his final message to the galaxy. To anyone listening across the stars, Hughes said, and his words carried the weight of someone who knew he was speaking for history. Remember that humans were here, and remember that we stood. We did not ask for this war. We only wanted to live in peace on a world we had built with our own hands, but when forced to choose between submission and death, we chose death. His gaze seemed to look directly at Krathox, even though the human could not possibly see him through the one-way transmission. We did not win, Hughes continued, but we made them remember us and every soldier they sent against us. Every ship they deployed, every weapon they used, it all stands as testament that humans cannot be easily conquered or cheaply defeated. Hughes paused and took a breath that rattled in his chest, and Krathox wondered if the human was injured or simply exhausted beyond what his body could endure. To the Coalition, Hughes said, and his voice grew harder. We leave you with this truth that you will carry with you long after the last of us falls. You have not beaten us. You have only shown us what you are willing to do and shown us what we are capable of when you push us to the edge. You came here thinking we would surrender because resistance was illogical, but you failed to understand that humans are not purely logical creatures. We are creatures of emotion and principle, of stubbornness and spite, and we would rather burn everything we have built than see it taken by force. The transmission continued for another minute, Hughes speaking words of farewell to the families of those who had died, and words of defiance to those who would claim his world, and then it ended with a simple statement that echoed through the command center like a bell tolling for the dead. We are ready, Hughes said. Come and finish what you started, because we will not make it easy. General Krathox felt something twist in his chest, and he prepared to give the order that would end this siege and finally bring the humans to heel. But before the words could leave his mouth, every alarm in the command center began screaming at once. Tactical displays lit up with new contacts, hundreds of them, emerging from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the star system, and sensors analyzed the signatures, attempting to identify the newcomers, and what they reported made Krathox's scales go pale. 117 warships bearing the insignia of Earth's United Defense Fleet, arranged in combat formation and burning, toward the colony at maximum acceleration. Commander, Velrith's colors flashed through patterns that indicated panic and shock, and his voice came through the communication system at a pitch that suggested he was barely maintaining control. They cannot be serious, he said, and his tank shook with the intensity of his agitation. We still outnumber them 8-1. We have 800 warships against their 100. And they must know that even if they somehow defeat us, the Coalition would respond with overwhelming force. What do they hope to achieve? A new transmission cut through the chaos, audio only, coming from the lead ship of the Earth Fleet, and the voice that spoke was male, and carried an accent that Krathox's translator identified as originating from Earth's northern hemisphere. This is Admiral Richard Cole of the United Defense Fleet, the voice said, and every word was clipped and precise like bullets from a rifle. We are responding to a distress call from our colonists on Kepler 442b, and we have monitored your assault on their settlement with growing concern. You have 60 seconds to cease all hostile operations and begin withdrawing your forces from the surface, or we will interpret your continued presence as an act of war against humanity. The command center exploded into frantic discussion, and Admiral Thrane's mandibles clicked so rapidly that the sound became a continuous buzz as he processed tactical data and probability calculations. They are bluffing, Thrane said, but his voice carried uncertainty that undermined his words. They must be bluffing because the alternative is suicide, and humans cannot be that irrational. But General Krathox was studying the sensor readings with growing dread, and what he saw told him that Admiral Cole was not bluffing at all. The human ships were smaller than Coalition vessels, cruisers and frigates where the Coalition fielded battleships and carriers, but their power signatures were enormous and suggested weapon systems far more advanced than intelligence reports had indicated. Their formation was not defensive, not the cautious positioning of a fleet hoping to negotiate, but the aggressive spread of attackers preparing to strike. And their acceleration curves showed they were burning fuel at rates that would leave them with minimal reserves for retreat, which meant they had not come here expecting to. Leave Krathox pulled up everything the Coalition knew about human military doctrine, and what he found confirmed his worst. Fears and the humans had a term they used to describe certain battles, a phrase that translated roughly as Pyrrhic victory, referring to wins so costly that they might as well be defeats. Human history was filled with such battles, conflicts where they had been willing to sacrifice everything to inflict maximum damage on their enemies, and their military academies taught that sometimes the only way to win was to demonstrate that victory would cost too much. That was what Admiral Cole was offering now. Not a fight that Earth could win, but a fight that would cripple the Coalition, fleet badly enough that other species might sense weakness and rebel. The 60 seconds ticked down with agonizing slowness, and Krathox weighed his options with the practiced calculation of a career officer who had faced difficult decisions before, but never one quite like this. If he ordered his fleet to engage, they would almost certainly destroy the Earth ships, but the cost would be catastrophic, and his 800 vessels would be reduced to perhaps 500 operational units, maybe fewer if the humans fought with the same desperate intensity their colonists had shown. The Coalition would be left vulnerable to challenges from other species. Uprisings that had been quietly simmering for cycles might boil over into open rebellion, and the carefully maintained balance of power that kept the galaxy stable would collapse, and Earth itself, having watched its fleet die, would respond with everything it had, beginning a war that could consume entire sectors of space. Or he could order a withdrawal, accepting what would be seen as defeat, but preserving his fleet and avoiding a wider conflict, and the Council would be furious. His career would be over, but the Coalition would survive and perhaps eventually could negotiate with humans from a position of maintained strength rather than damaged pride. Admiral Thrain was arguing for engagement, pointing to tactical displays that showed Coalition superiority in numbers and firepower, and Commander Velrith was urging caution, his colors flickering with patterns that spoke of fear and uncertainty, but Krathox barely heard them because his mind was elsewhere, reviewing everything he had learned about humans over the past 5 weeks, remembering Lisa Bennett standing alone in that wheat field, remembering Governor Hughes's final transmission, remembering the way untrained civilians had made professional soldiers pay for every meter of ground. These humans did not think like other species, did not calculate odds the way military science dictated. 6 months had passed since the withdrawal from Kepler 442b, and General Krathox stood once again in the Great Hall of Viridian Prime. But this time his posture carried the weight of experience rather than confidence. The crystal walls caught light from the 3 suns just as they always had, but somehow the chamber seemed darker, as if the events at that distant colony had cast shadows that reached even here. The council members filed in slowly, taking their seats with the solemnity of beings who knew they were about to discuss something that could reshape the galaxy. And Krathox noted that many of them looked older somehow, worn down by the weight of decisions they had made and consequences they had not foreseen. He activated the holographic display and began his presentation, without preamble because everyone present had read the preliminary reports and knew why they were here. "We must revise our threat assessment of humanity," Krathox said, and his voice lacked the certainty that had characterized his previous briefings. "Over the past 6 months, I have compiled data from the Kepler 442b operation, analyzed human history and culture, and consulted with xenopsychologists from 17 different species, and the conclusion is unanimous. Humans are not a species that calculates odds before fighting. They are a species that fights first and counts the cost afterward." He displayed a complex 3-dimensional model of human psychology, layered with data from thousands of interviews and observations and conflict analyses, and the model pulsed with patterns that conventional military logic could not predict. "Every other species in the Coalition operates on fundamentally logical principles," Krathox explained, and his forearms gestured to emphasize his points. "When defeated, they surrender because continued resistance serves no purpose. When outnumbered, They retreat because preservation of forces is a basic tactical necessity. When threatened with extinction, they negotiate because survival is the ultimate goal. He paused, looking around at the assembled council. Humans do none of these things predictably, he said, and that makes them unlike anything we have encountered in 3,000 cycles of galactic civilization. Commander Velrith spoke up, his colors showing patterns that suggested careful thought, rather than impulsive reaction. Surely we can simply avoid them, he said, and his voice carried a note of hope that sounded almost desperate. Their expansion is limited, their technology is still developing, and we control thousands of worlds scattered across dozens of sectors. We can share the galaxy without coming into conflict if we simply respect their territorial claims. Admiral Thrain rose to respond, his multiple legs carrying him to stand beside Krathox at the center of the chamber. That is precisely the problem, Thrain said, and his mandibles clicked with agitation. The humans are now expanding rapidly, establishing new colonies at a rate that our projections indicate will bring them into contact with 17 different coalition member species within 50 cycles. They see us as a threat after what happened at Kepler 442b. They are building warships at an unprecedented pace, and they are forming alliances with other species who view the coalition with suspicion. He pulled up a star map that showed human space as a growing sphere of influence, surrounded by networks of diplomatic connections. The Vorkath Dominion has opened formal trade relations with Earth. The Kreelan sovereignty is negotiating a mutual defense pact, and at least 6 other species are quietly reaching out to human ambassadors. The galaxy is realigning, and humans are becoming a focal point for those who want alternatives to coalition authority. The chamber filled with the sounds of worried discussion, voices in dozens of languages overlapping as the translation system struggled to keep pace, and Krathox let them talk for a moment before calling for silence. I have run extensive simulations, he said, and he pulled up a tactical analysis that had taken teams of strategists 3 months to complete. This model shows what would happen if the coalition engaged in a full-scale war with Earth, and the results are consistent across thousands of variations. Even if we achieved total victory, destroying their fleets and occupying their homeworld, we would lose between 30 and 40% of our military forces. Our civilization would survive, but our dominance would end. Other species would sense the weakness, and rebellions that we have suppressed for cycles would erupt across multiple sectors. The coalition as we know it would collapse within a generation. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of quiet that comes when beings who have always been certain of their power suddenly confront the possibility of its loss. The Council Arbiter, an ancient creature whose species had founded the coalition millennia ago, stirred from his contemplation and spoke in a voice like wind through canyons. "What do you propose, General?" he asked, and his words carried the weight of authority that few dared to question. "You have presented us with a threat assessment that challenges everything we have built, but assessment without solution is merely fear. What would you have us do?" Krathox had known this question was coming and had prepared his answer carefully, knowing that it would end his military career, but hoping it might save the coalition. "We propose a treaty," he said, and the words felt heavy on his tongue. "Not surrender, not subordination, but recognition of reality. We acknowledge human territory and their right to self-governance. We open trade relations that benefit both our civilizations, and we establish diplomatic protocols that allow us to resolve disputes without military confrontation." He paused, meeting the eyes of as many council members as he could. "And most importantly, we never again threaten their colonies or their people, because doing so would trigger a conflict that neither side wants, but that humans would pursue regardless of cost." A general from the Draken warrior caste, a species renowned for their military prowess and pride, rose to his feet with scales bristling in anger. "This is cowardice," he spat, and his voice carried the contempt of someone who had never truly faced defeat. "We should crush them now before they grow stronger, before their alliances solidify, before other species begin to think that the coalition can be defied with impunity. Every day we delay makes them more dangerous and makes us look weaker." But Admiral Thrain moved to stand opposite the Draken general, his compound eyes fixed on the warrior with an intensity that made even that fierce species hesitate. "You did not watch the recordings from Kepler 442b as I did," Thrain said, and his voice carried a quiet certainty that silenced the protests beginning to form. "You did not see farmers holding positions against professional soldiers. You did not hear Governor Hughes speaking defiance even as his world burned. You did not witness the moment when Admiral Cole's fleet arrived and made it clear they would die before letting their people be conquered. He paused, his mandibles spreading in a gesture that his species used to emphasize critical points. I tell you this truth and you will believe it or not as you choose, but it is truth nonetheless. If we go to war with humanity, even if we win, we will be destroyed by what we must become in the process. They will force us to match their brutality, their refusal to yield, their willingness to sacrifice everything for principle, and in doing so, we will lose what makes the coalition something more than just another empire built on fear and violence. The debate continued for hours, arguments flowing back and forth as military officers weighed strategic considerations against political realities, and as diplomats calculated the costs of war against the costs of peace. But gradually, reluctantly, consensus began to form around the idea that humanity represented a new kind of challenge, one that could not be solved through traditional applications of force. The vote was called as the three suns set beyond the crystal walls, casting the chamber in hues of orange and purple and deep blue, and when the results were tallied, the treaty proposal had passed by a narrow but sufficient margin. General Krathox received his new assignment with mixed emotions, and he would no longer command fleets or plan military operations, but would instead serve as the coalition's ambassador to the human sphere, responsible for building the bridges that might prevent war. It was a demotion in everything but title, a graceful way for the council to remove him from military command without the disgrace of outright dismissal. But he accepted it because he believed in the mission, and because someone needed to do the work of making peace. His ship arrived at Earth 3 weeks later, approaching the blue and white marble that hung in space like a jewel against the darkness, and as they drew closer, he saw the orbital defense platforms bristling with weapons and the massive shipyards where new vessels were being constructed at a rate that confirmed his worst projections. Earth was preparing for war even as they negotiated for peace, maintaining the capability to fight while hoping they would not need to, and Krathox understood that this was simply how humans approached everything. They hoped for the best but prepared for the worst, and they never, ever assumed that good intentions would protect them from harsh realities. The formal reception took place in a building in a city called Geneva, a place that humans apparently used for important diplomatic functions, and Krathox met with representatives of Earth's various governments and military services. They were polite, professional, and completely clear about their boundaries, and they would accept peace but only as equals.